Chapter 15 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 15. 1808. Spain. In the midst of the fête at Fontainebleau came the unexpected news that England had sent a fleet and an expeditionary force against Denmark, and that after a 3 days' bombardment of Copenhagen the Danish fleet had been seized and carried away. It developed later that through an indiscretion a secret clause of the Treaty of Tilsit had become known to the English cabinet, which jumped to the conclusion that Denmark was to be constrained by France to close its ports against British goods. This was the English excuse for this outrage upon a neutral and inoffensive power. The immediate result was the conclusion of an alliance between Denmark and France, but without the fleet there was no possibility of closing the Sound against British vessels. The Czar, who had undertaken at Tilsit to mediate between France and England, was now forced to acknowledge that his efforts would be vain, and in accordance with the terms of the alliance on the 7th of November, 1807, he declared war on England. The Czar took this step with great reluctance, for Russia was not a manufacturing nation, and was very dependent on British goods, which it paid for by the export of the products of its rich fields and forests. The opposition in Russia to joining the continental blockade was almost universal, and this feeling had much to do later with the final rupture with France. For the moment, however, Alexander was willing to yield to the wishes of Napoleon; but he at once made a demand that, as proposed at Tilsit, he should be allowed to take possession of the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, as well as of Finland, which still belonged to Sweden. Napoleon refused peremptorily to consent to this dismemberment of Turkey, but he urged the Czar to proceed to the conquest of Finland, and offered for this purpose to send the corps of Bernadotte to his assistance. Although the heart of Alexander was more set upon securing the principalities, he accepted the other proposition, and at the last of February suddenly invaded Finland. But the conquest did not turn out to be as easy as he had expected. The Swedes, with the assistance of English troops, put up a stout resistance. The promised corps of Bernadotte did not materialize, and the Czar, owing to the continued French occupation of Prussia, did not like to reinforce his expeditionary army from that quarter. He was therefore forced to recall his troops from the Danube, which was just what Napoleon desired, as it meant giving up any hopes of conquest there for the present. Napoleon now turned his attention to Italy. The young Dowager Queen of Etruria, who was surrounded by advisers unfriendly to France, had opened the port of Livorno to English goods, which were brought in under the American flag. The last of August, Napoleon sent a small force to take possession of Tuscany. The Queen was informed that provision would be made for her in the partition of Portugal, which was then being arranged with Spain. Tuscany and the islands of Corsica and Elba were incorporated into the empire and apportioned into 3 departments. There now remained in Italy only one small state which was not subject to Napoleon's power, that of the Pope. This must be controlled if the continental blockade was to be rigidly enforced. As the Holy Father, after prolonged negotiations, finally refused to comply with Napoleon's demands, early in February, 1808, the Papal States were occupied by French troops and later were formally annexed to the Empire. At Tilsit it had been arranged between the Czar and Napoleon that Portugal should be requested to enter the continental system, and in the event of her refusal should be treated as a common enemy. In this action Spain was to be called on to cooperate. This was making no small demand on that government, for the Crown Prince John of Portugal, regent for his mother, who was of unsound mind, had married the daughter of Charles IV. Nevertheless, Spain acquiesced. Before telling the story of the Spanish drama upon which the curtain is about to rise, it will be well to take a look at the characters who are to play the principal roles. The family of the Spanish Bourbons was descended from Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV. Of France, who became king in 1700 under the title of Philip V. In that year the male line of the Spanish Habsburgs became extinct, and the conflicting claims to the throne gave rise to the War of the Spanish Succession. The nearest natural heir to the throne was of the royal Bourbon line of France, the elder sister of the late king, Charles II having married Louis XIV. Failing the Bourbons, the next heirs were the descendants of a younger sister of Charles, who had married the Emperor Leopold I of Austria. Louis claimed the throne for his grandson Philip, who was proclaimed king in 1700, and was confirmed by the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. In 1808 the family was composed of 7 persons, of whom only 4 concern us: the king, Charles IV., then 60 years of age; his ignoble wife, who was 3 years younger; his eldest son, the Prince of the Asturias, afterwards Ferdinand VII., a boy of 20; and his daughter, Marie Louise, widow of the King of Etruria. To this interesting group should be added Emmanuel Godoy, Prince de la Paix, the King's favorite and the Queen's lover. Born in 1767, Godoy, who belonged to a noble but poor family, had begun his career as a garde du corps. His handsome appearance and the elegance of his manners had won the favor of the Queen, and he had become First Minister and the real ruler of the Spanish monarchy. The King seemed to be, if possible, as much infatuated with him as the Queen. To his title of Prime Minister, Godoy joined those of Generalissimo and Grand Admiral. At the time of the Prussian campaign, Godoy for a moment had the idea of taking part against France, but at the news of the battle of Jena he humbled himself before the Emperor, and sent a contingent of 14,000 Spaniards to join the Grand Army. By a treaty signed at Fontainebleau the 27th of October, 1807, he further agreed to place at the Emperor's disposal an army of 24,000 men, who with the same number of French were to undertake the conquest of Portugal. It was arranged that that country should be divided into 3 portions. The north was to be given to the grandson of Charles IV., the little King of Etruria, in exchange for Tuscany; the south was to be erected in a sovereignty for the Prince de la Paix; and the centre was to be occupied by the French. At the time that the treaty of Fontainebleau was signed, Ferdinand was at swords' points with his father. Detested by his mother, and on bad terms with the favorite, he had formed the plan of seizing the government. The King, advised of this plot, put himself at the head of his guards the 29th of October, and went to the apartment of the young prince, whom he put under arrest. While these events were happening at Madrid, Junot, at the head of the French army of 25,000 men, had crossed the Bidassoa the 18th of October, 1807, and had advanced without difficulty to the gates of Lisbon. Before his arrival there, the royal family of Portugal and all the principal families of the kingdom had embarked on the fleet with all of their valuables, and sailed for Brazil. On the 1st day of March, 1808, Napoleon notified the court of Madrid of his intention to annex all of Spain north of the Ebro to the French Empire. At the same time he offered to the Spanish monarchy, by way of compensation, all of Portugal. The King was stupefied by this proposition, but did not dare to make any open opposition. In great secrecy he made preparations to follow the example of the royal family of Portugal and flee to America. But the news in some way leaked out, and there was a popular uprising, in which the troops joined, to oppose the departure of the royal family. The King, terrified by the tumult, abdicated the crown in favor of his son, who took the name of Ferdinand VII. The question now was, whether this abdication would be recognized by Napoleon. A French army under Murat was already advancing on Madrid, and on the 24th of March it entered the city. The new King made his entry the same day, and as the population imagined that the Emperor was the ally of the new sovereign, the French troops received a warm welcome. Charles, who was at the Escurial, now wrote the Emperor that his abdication had been forced upon him, and asked for assistance in recovering his throne. At the same time Ferdinand also appealed; and on the 10th of April he set out to meet the Emperor at Bayonne, where Charles and his Queen had already been summoned. Napoleon at this time was at the Château of Marac at Bayonne, where he was joined by the Empress on the 27th of April. Here Charles and his wife arrived 3 days later, accompanied by Godoy. Meanwhile grave events had happened at Madrid. The people, enraged at the treatment of their sovereigns, on the 2nd of May broke out in open revolt against the French, but the emeute was violently suppressed by Murat. When this news reached Bayonne, the old King, who was continually haunted by the specters of Charles I and Louis XVI, voluntarily ceded to Napoleon his rights to the crown of Spain, for which he received in return the Châteaux of Compiègne and Chambord as residences, with a civil list of 7 millions and a half of francs. 5 days later Ferdinand also resigned his claims to the throne, and received the Château of Navarre, with an income of 1,000,000 francs. History certainly has never recorded a more remarkable bargain than this sale for a paltry sum of the crown of Spain and the Indies by the descendants of the Grand Monarque to the son of an obscure Corsican gentleman. On the 10th of May, Charles and his wife, accompanied by the young Queen of Etruria and Godoy, left for Fontainebleau, where they were to live until the Château of Compiègne was prepared for their reception. The following day, Ferdinand set out for the Château of Valençay, where he was to be for a time the guest of M. de Talleyrand. On the 7th of June, Joseph arrived at Bayonne to be proclaimed King of Spain, and 2 days later he left there to take possession of his new throne. On the 20th of the same month, Napoleon and Josephine started on a round of visits to the principal cities of the south and west of France, and reached St. Cloud the 14th of August. It was during this trip that the Emperor heard of the capitulation of Dupont at Belen, the first striking disaster to his arms. The eyes of all Europe were now turned to the little German city of Erfurt, where Napoleon was to meet the Czar. The conference began the 27th of September, and lasted until the 14th of October. All the allies of the Emperor were present: the kings of Saxony, Bavaria, Würtemberg, and Westphalia, the Prince Primate, and all the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine. The actors of the Comédie Française played before a parterre of kings. One evening, when the Oedipus of Voltaire was being performed, as Talma declaimed the words, "The friendship of a great man is a true gift of the gods," the Czar, amidst the applause of the audience, pressed in the most cordial manner the hand of his former and future foe. To her great regret, Josephine had not been allowed to accompany the Emperor, and she divined that her divorce would be one of the subjects of discussion. In this she was not mistaken. The Czar had two sisters of a marriageable age, the Grand Duchesses Catherine and Anne. Talleyrand, whom Napoleon had taken with him, broached the subject to Alexander. The Czar, while protesting his earnest desire to become the brother in law of the Emperor, stated frankly that his mother would be strongly opposed to the plan, and that the only way to obtain her consent was to satisfy the hopes of Russia with regard to Constantinople. It is perhaps unnecessary to state that Napoleon was not willing to pay this price for the honor of an alliance with the imperial family of Russia. The chief practical results of the Erfurt Conference can be summed up in a few words. The Franco-Russian alliance was continued, though on somewhat strained terms. The Danubian principalities were reluctantly conceded to the Czar, and he was given a free hand in dealing with Sweden. For himself, Napoleon had gained nothing except a breathing spell during which he could proceed, without danger of immediate interference, to the regulation of affairs in Spain. It was nothing less than a diplomatic defeat. He also made a great mistake in taking Talleyrand with him. This unprincipled minister had already begun to turn against his master, and he embraced the opportunity to give Alexander advice which was later to prove very detrimental to the Emperor. When Joseph arrived at Madrid in July, 1808, he brought with him a new constitution and also capable ministers to execute it. He came with the best of intentions to raise the decadent kingdom to new heights of power and splendor. But the people would have none of it. Their national pride had been wounded by the treatment of their legitimate sovereigns, and their religious fervor had been aroused by Napoleon's action in robbing the Pope of his throne. The nation refused ratification to the Treaty of Bayonne, and sprang to arms as one man. The revolt spread with furious rapidity. Before the end of July, Joseph was compelled to abandon his capital and withdraw behind the Ebro with the entire French army. The Spaniards had sent messengers to London to ask assistance, and in August English troops landed in Portugal. The last of that month Junot was forced to capitulate, although on terms most honorable to the French army. When Napoleon left Bayonne in July, he had felt no doubt that the revolt in Spain would soon be put down, and he was not a little disturbed by the news of the next 2 months. For the sake of his own prestige it was necessary to crush this rebellious movement at once, and restore his brother to the throne. He therefore resolved to enter Spain himself with the Grand Army, the invincible veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland. Confident of an easy success over the untrained Spanish levies, Napoleon lightly embarked on this 5 years' war, which was to baffle him at every stage, to drain his resources, to cost him 300,000 valuable lives, and to end in failure. He was to encounter for the first time the same kind of national uprising which during the Revolution had made France invincible against the armed hosts of Europe. His previous wars had been waged with governments which relied for their defense on professional armies. Now he was to face a whole nation in arms, resolved to die rather than to submit to the invader. The Spanish rising was to be the first of a series of popular national movements which were to prove Napoleon's undoing. At St. Helena he said, "It was the Spanish ulcer which ruined me." This peculiar land, so fatal to French arms, deserves a word of description. The Pyrenees, which separate France from Spain except at the two ends near the Bay of Biscay and the Mediterranean, for a distance of 250 miles, were then crossed only by mule tracks. The main highway from France starts at Bayonne, crosses the mountains to Vittoria, and runs thence, via Miranda, on the Ebro, through Burgos, to Madrid. The central plateau of the country is barren, the fertile districts lying near the coasts. Madrid is a political rather than a commercial centre. From the capital radiate highways leading to the principal cities. In the parts of Europe where Napoleon had conducted his previous campaigns, the rivers and mountains had prescribed the strategy, but in Spain geography was against him. Both the rivers and the mountains ran in the wrong direction, right across his path. The country was too poor to support an army, and the means of communication were execrable. It was a country admirably designed for the defensive, very difficult for the offensive. In the passes and valleys between the successive mountain ranges it was not easy for large armies to operate, and the country was well adapted for guerrilla warfare. As Henri IV wisely said, "In Spain large armies will starve and small ones will get beaten." Napoleon was to learn this lesson too late. By the end of October, Napoleon had over 200,000 men, ready to march into Spain. About 100,000 had been taken from Italy and southern France, and the corps of Victor, Ney, Mortier, Lannes, and Soult had been brought back from Germany, leaving only 100,000 troops across the Rhine. As soon as the Erfurt Conference was over, Napoleon set out for Spain, arriving at Bayonne on the 3rd of November. The French centre was then posted on the main road from Bayonne to the Ebro. It comprised the corps of Soult, Victor, and Ney, the Guard, and the cavalry reserve under Bessieres, in all about 75,000 men. Napoleon's plan was to advance to Burgos and interpose between the enemy's two flank forces. Immediately on his arrival the troops were set in motion. The small Spanish forces were easily scattered, but small guerrilla bodies formed in the rear of the French advance and seriously hampered the system of communications. Napoleon appeared before Madrid on the 2nd of December, bombarded the city on the 3rd, and entered it the following day. He then made arrangements to have the Guard and 3 corps at Madrid by the middle of the month, while only Soult and Moncey would be detached. At the same time the corps of Junot and Mortier would be crossing the frontier to join him. In the meantime the English army under Sir John Moore had advanced towards Burgos. When Napoleon heard of this movement, he left Madrid with the Guard and Ney's corps to cut off Moore's retreat, while Soult held him in front. As soon as Moore learned of his danger, he turned back, and made good his escape. The Emperor then returned to Madrid with the Guard, leaving Ney and Soult to deal with Moore. Soult pursued Moore as far as the coast, and drove the remnant of the British army back upon their ships. Corunna and Ferrol, with all their supplies, fell into the hands of the French. Sir John Moore was killed, and his burial has been described in one of the most celebrated poems in the English language. Napoleon reinstated his brother in Madrid, and when in January he was called back to France by the menace of another war with Austria, he could look back upon a series of successes which held out the hope that Spain would soon be completely pacified. He felt so sure of the situation that he even withdrew 30,000 men for service on the Rhine. During the few weeks that Napoleon stayed in Madrid he was constantly occupied with plans for the upbuilding of the country. He abolished the Inquisition, also the remains of the feudal system, also the tariff boundaries which shut off province from province. He also closed 2/3 of the monasteries. Probably Napoleon, if he had had the opportunity, would have so firmly established the new institutions that they would have finally taken root, and Spain to day would be a far more progressive state, but time was necessary, and time he could not command. On the 18th of January, 1809, Napoleon left this country which he alone could have conquered, which he never was to see again, and which was destined to ruin his empire. He left behind him 300,000 men and 5 marshals of France. On the 23rd of January he was at Paris. CHAPter 16.